September the 2nd, 1944. The Pacific Ocean is vast. It is a desert of water. To the human eye, looking down from 10,000 feet, it looks peaceful, a never-ending sheet of blue. But on this specific morning, the blue was about to turn red. We are hovering above a tiny speck of volcanic rock called Chichijima. It lies 700 miles south of Tokyo. It looks insignificant on a map, a jagged tooth of rock sticking out of the waves. But in 1944, this rock was one of the most heavily fortified places on Earth. The Japanese called it the Iwo Jima of the North. The Americans called it the Dragon's Jaw. The sky is black with smoke. Anti-aircraft shells are exploding like dark flowers in the air. Shrapnel is tearing through the clouds. Flying through this storm of steel is a squadron of TBM Avenger torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier USS San Jacinto. Inside one of these planes, clutching the control stick with sweaty leather gloves, is a pilot. He is tall. He is skinny. He is barely 20 years old. His name is Lieutenant Junior Grade George Herbert Walker Bush. Back home in Massachusetts, he is just a kid who misses his girlfriend. Here, he is a speck of flesh inside a metal machine flying straight into the mouth of hell. He doesn't know it yet, but history is watching him. He doesn't know that in 40 years, he will hold the codes to the world's largest nuclear arsenal. He will be the 41st President of the United States. But right now, none of that matters. Right now, he is not a president. He is prey. Aero 7:15 a.m. A Japanese anti-aircraft shell finds its mark. It slams into the belly of George Bush's plane. The explosion rips through the fuselage. The engine coughs, sputters, and catches fire. Thick, black, oily smoke fills the cockpit instantly. It chokes the lungs. It blinds the eyes. Inside the plane, chaos. "We're hit! We're hit!" Bush yells into the radio. "My engine is on fire!" The plane lurches forward. It starts to dive. Gravity takes hold. The target. The radio tower on the mountain is still ahead. Despite the fire, despite the smoke, Bush keeps the plane steady for one more second. He drops his bombs. Direct hit. But the plane is dying. Bail out! Bail out! This is the order no pilot ever wants to give. Bush turns his plane away from the island, trying to get as far out to sea as possible. He claws at the canopy release. The wind screams into the cockpit at 200 miles per hour. He climbs out onto the wing. The tail of the plane is engulfed in flames. He jumps. Imagine the sensation. 1 second, you are inside a burning machine. The next, you are suspended in the air. Silence. George Bush floats down. He checks his body. He has hit his head on the tail of the plane. Blood is streaming down his face. It stings his eyes. He looks up. His parachute is torn, but it holds. He looks down, and what he sees turns his blood to ice. He is drifting towards the water, but he is not alone. Below him, speeding out from the island's harbor, are Japanese patrol boats. They are cutting through the waves, leaving white wakes behind them. They are coming for him. Bush knows the stories. Every pilot in the Pacific knew the stories. The Imperial Japanese Army did not take prisoners kindly. The code of Bushido, twisted by years of brutal war, said that surrender was a disgrace. Prisoners were often used for bayonet practice or beheaded. Bush pulls his service revolver from his holster, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. He checks the cylinder. He makes a promise to himself as he dangles in the air. "I will not be taken." He hits the water. The parachute drags him under for a terrifying second. He cuts the lines. He surfaces, gasping for air. The salt water burns his open head wound. He inflates his tiny, yellow, one-man life raft. It looks like a toy in the massive ocean. He climbs in. He starts paddling with his hands, paddling away from the island, paddling for his life. The Japanese boats are getting closer. He can see the soldiers on the deck. He can see their rifles. They are closing the distance. 5 miles, 3 miles. Bush is exhausted. He is bleeding. He is hallucinating from the pain. He prays. Then something breaks the surface of the water behind him. A periscope, then a conning tower, then the long, gray hull of a submarine, the USS Finback. It rises like a steel whale from the depths. The hatch opens. American sailors rush onto the deck. "Over here! Over here!" The Japanese boats see the submarine. They turn around. They know they cannot fight a sub. The sailors pull George Bush out of the water. He collapses on the metal deck. He vomits seawater. He shakes uncontrollably. "You're safe, kid. You're safe." Bush looks at the sailors. His eyes are wild. "The others!" he screams. "My crew! The other pilots! Where are they?" The sailors look at the empty ocean. "We don't see anyone else, Lieutenant. Just you. George Bush survived. He was the only one. But this story isn't about the one who got away. This story is about the 8 who didn't." While George Bush was drinking hot coffee in the safety of the submarine, 8 other American flyers were washing up on the shores of Chichijima. They didn't have a submarine. They didn't have luck. They had parachuted right into the hands of the enemy. Let us speak their names, because for 60 years history forgot them. Floyd Hall, a brave man from Sedalia, Missouri. Marv Mershon, a radio operator from Los Angeles. Jimmy Dye, Warren Earl Vaughn, Dick Whalhoff, Grady York, Glenn Frazier, Billich, 8 young men, fathers, sons, husbands. They were dragged from the water by Japanese soldiers. They were beaten with rifle butts until their faces were swollen. They were stripped of their flight suits and tied up with rough hemp rope. They were marched through the streets of the island. The Japanese civilians threw stones at them. They spat on them. To the defenders of Chichijima, these men were demons. They were the ones dropping bombs on their homes. And now the demons were captured. But the Americans thought, "We are prisoners of war. There are rules. The Geneva Convention. We will be put in a camp. We will wait for the war to end." They were wrong. Chichijima was not a normal island, and the man in charge of it was not a normal general. His name was Lieutenant General Yoshio Tachibana. Remember his face: a small man, an alcoholic, a sadist. His eyes were cold, dead shark's eyes. The war had been going badly for Japan. The supply lines were cut. Food was scarce. The soldiers on the island were eating rice mixed with sawdust. They were hungry. But General Tachibana had a different kind of hunger. He looked at the 8 terrified Americans kneeling in the sand. He didn't see human beings. He didn't see soldiers. He saw livestock. The nightmare that was about to unfold on Chichijima would be so horrific, so grotesque, that the United States government would keep it top secret for nearly 60 years. They were afraid that if the American public knew what happened next, they wouldn't just defeat Japan. They would annihilate it. What happens when men lose their souls? What happens when civilization is stripped away and only the beast remains? Welcome to the banquet of the damned. The madness began a few weeks after the capture. The bombing raids were getting worse. The Japanese officers were frustrated. They were losing the war, and they knew it. To boost morale, General Tachibana ordered a party. A celebration for his senior officers. Sake was flowing, but they needed meat. There was no beef. There was no pork. But there were prisoners. According to the sworn testimony given during the war crimes trials, an order was issued by Major Matoba, one of Tachibana's subordinates. The order was simple, yet incomprehensible to the modern mind. He wanted chemo. That is the Japanese word for liver. Under the cover of darkness, a doctor was summoned. a man who had sworn an oath to save lives. He walked into the cell of one of the prisoners. We believe it was the radio operator, Marv Mershon. The prisoner was blindfolded. He was led out to a freshly dug grave near the airfield. He was made to kneel. I want you to imagine the terror, kneeling in the dirt, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by men speaking a language you don't understand. The smell of the jungle, the sound of the ocean. The execution was brutal, a sword stroke, but the horror didn't end with death. It started with it. The doctors moved in immediately. They removed the liver and the thigh muscle. The bodies were thrown into the pit. That night, inside the command bunker, the smell of cooking meat filled the air. The cook prepared the dish with soy sauce, vegetables, and bamboo shoots. It was served as sukiyaki. General Tachibana and his officers sat around the table. They ate, they drank, they laughed. They believed that by consuming the enemy, they were absorbing their strength. They believed it made them invincible. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened again and again. Floyd Hall, Jimmy Dye. One by one, the flyboys disappeared. They were butchered like cattle. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the families of these men were waiting for telegrams. They were praying for a miracle. They looked at the empty chairs at the dinner table and hoped their sons were safe in a prison camp. Maybe hungry, maybe cold, but alive. They had no idea that their sons had already been consumed. While the feast continued on the island, George Bush was writing letters home from his bunk on the aircraft carrier. "I wonder where the guys are," he wrote. "I hope they are treated well." He had no idea. Nobody had any idea until the war ended, 1946. The guns of World War II had fallen silent. The smoke had cleared. But on the island of Chichijima, a different kind of war was beginning. A war for the truth. Colonel Presley Rixey of the United States Marines arrived on the island with a team of investigators. Their mission was simple: find the missing pilots. They had the flight logs. They knew the names. They knew that 8 men had parachuted onto this rock. But there was no trace of them. No prisoner of war camps. No graves. Nothing. The Japanese commander, General Tachibana, met the investigators with the politeness of a career diplomat. He bowed low. He offered them tea. When asked about the Americans, he shook his head sadly. "It was a tragedy," he said. "They were killed by your own bombing raids. We buried them in the cemetery, but the bombs destroyed the graves. It was a perfect lie. It was logical. In the chaos of war, friendly fire happens." The American investigators almost closed the file. They were ready to pack their bags and go home. But Colonel Rixey had a gut feeling. Something was wrong. The Japanese soldiers on the island were too quiet. Their eyes shifted nervously when the Americans walked by. Rixey decided to dig deeper. The breakthrough didn't come from an officer. It came from the bottom of the hierarchy. A young Japanese soldier, barely a man, approached the American camp late one night. He was shaking. He knew that if his superiors found out, he would be killed. But the guilt was eating him alive. He whispered 2 words that changed everything: the beach. The next morning, the Marines went to the beach. They didn't bring metal detectors, they brought shovels. They started digging in the sand near the airfield. 3 feet down, nothing. 4 feet down, nothing. Then, a shovel hit something hard, not rock, bone. They pulled up the remains. The medical examiners moved in. What they found confused them. The bodies were not shattered by bombs. They were dismembered. Heads were missing. Limbs were severed with surgical precision. But the most disturbing detail was the bones themselves. There were cut marks, deep scores made by knives. This wasn't war. This was butchery. The investigators returned to General Tachibana. The politeness was gone. They arrested him. They arrested Major Matoba. They arrested the doctors. The interrogations were brutal. The Japanese officers, realizing the game was over, turned on each other like wolves. Major Matoba, hoping to save his own neck, handed over a document that is perhaps the most terrifying piece of evidence in military history. It was an order, written in his own hand. It detailed exactly who was to be executed and exactly which parts of the body were to be delivered to the officers' mess hall. The trial took place on the island of Guam in 1947. It was supposed to be a standard war crimes tribunal, but when the testimony began, the courtroom doors were locked. The military police didn't want the press to hear the details. A Japanese naval surgeon took the stand. He described in a calm, clinical voice how he had operated on a living American prisoner. He described removing the liver while the patient was still breathing. He explained that the liver was considered a cure for stomach ailments. He explained that General Tachibana believed eating the enemy would transfer their warrior spirit to him. The American judges sat in stunned silence. They looked at General Tachibana. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an old, tired man. He claimed he was just following tradition. He claimed it was necessary for morale. But the tribunal didn't buy it. General Tachibana, along with 4 others, was sentenced to death by hanging. As the rope was placed around his neck, he didn't ask for forgiveness. He reportedly cursed the Americans one last time. Justice was served. The monsters were dead. The investigators wrote their final report. It was a thick dossier filled with photos, confessions, and anatomical diagrams. They prepared to send it to the families of the victims. They prepared to tell the world. But then, the phone rang. It was Washington. The United States government was in a difficult position. The year was 1947. The Cold War was starting. The Soviet Union was the new enemy. America needed Japan to be a strong ally in the Pacific. They needed the Japanese people to cooperate. Top officials at the Pentagon looked at the Chichijima file. They realized that this story was radioactive. If the American public learned that their boys weren't just killed, but eaten, the rage would be uncontrollable. It could destroy the fragile peace. So a decision was made. A decision that prioritized politics over truth. The file was stamped top secret. It was buried in the deepest archives of the Navy. Then came the letters, the hardest letters anyone ever had to write. The government wrote to the mothers and wives of the 8 flyboys. To the mother of Marv Mershon, they wrote, "Your son was executed by a firing squad while serving his country." To the wife of Floyd Hall, they wrote, "He died a soldier's death." It was a lie, a sanitized, clean lie. It spared the families the gruesome details. It allowed them to grieve without the nightmare of imagining the cannibal feast. But it also meant that the world forgot the horror of Chichijima. Decades passed. The flyboys were forgotten. But one man survived. George Herbert Walker Bush. His life was a series of triumphs. He became a war hero, a millionaire oil tycoon, director of the CIA, vice president, and finally, the 41st President of the United States. He sat in the Oval Office. He dined with kings and queens. He commanded the most powerful military in history. But in the quiet moments, late at night, his mind often went back to 1944. He suffered from what we now call survivor's guilt. He constantly asked himself, why me? Why was I the one pulled from the water? Why did God save me and not them? He didn't know the answer. And for a long time, he didn't know the fate of his friends. He assumed they had died quickly. It wasn't until the early 2000s, when the files were finally declassified, that an elderly George Bush learned the full truth. He read the book Flyboys by James Bradley. He learned that while he was safe on the submarine, his squad mates were being butchered. The revelation shook him to his core. In 2002, George Bush returned to Chichijima. He was an old man now, walking with a cane. He stood on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, the same ocean where he had floated in his yellow raft. He met with a Japanese soldier who had been there that day. The two old warriors shook hands. There was no hate left, only sadness. Bush threw a flower wreath into the water. He whispered the names of his crewmates. It was a moment of closure, but it was also a reminder of the terrifying randomness of war. History is written by the victors, but the scars are carried by everyone. The Chichijima Incident is more than just a horror story. It is a mirror. It shows us that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we think. General Tachibana was an educated man, a leader. Yet under the pressure of war, he became a beast. We remember George Bush as a president, but we must also remember Floyd Hall, Marv Mershon, Jimmy Dye, the men who never came home, the men who were erased from history to keep the peace. They were the Flyboys. And this is their story. This is homecoming scars.